Right, so thank you so much. I was really excited to get this invitation, in part because I've been wanting to connect more with folks who are in cybersecurity research more properly. I work on influence operations, so a little bit of a different space. But because of the ways that we see things evolving, particularly challenges around attribution of influence operations and ways in which hack and leak is active, kind of provides the fodder for so much of it, one of the things we're looking at Stanford is trying to develop a better understanding of how these two types of actions fit together, and what we can learn about that, and how we should be thinking about disinformation and influence operations as kind of a new normal, and how we're going to be thinking about responding to them. So I've been studying this topic since around 2015. Let me click. That's advancing here, but not for you guys. Are you seeing that? There we go. All right. So this is a network graph of the conversation around vaccines in California in 2015, which was some of the work that I did just as I was just a mom. I was doing this at night because I was trying to figure out, we were trying to get this law passed in California, and it was around eliminating the right to opt your child out of vaccines for school. We used to have a system where you could just sign a paper and then you didn't have to vaccinate your kid. So I found this egregious and started working late at night trying to understand who was driving the anti-vaccine movement in California, what we could learn about those conversations on social platforms, and how what appeared to be very small groups of people were really able to command the conversation. So looking not so much at influence operations in the malign subversive sense of the word, but really more an understanding of how had the kind of information architecture shift and the resulting kind of proliferation of many types of voices also in some ways led to a framework in which very, very tiny groups of people could really achieve a disproportionate impact on the conversation. And so we were using social network analysis just to try to understand what was happening there in that conversation. This was the hashtag SB277, which was the name that our bill was given in California. And this is not really the thing to focus on, but if you've never delved into one of these, basically the larger circles indicate it's a measure of centrality, just how important a voice is to a conversation. The lines are showing who's talking to who, who's replying to who, and the different colors represent the different clusters of community in a conversation. So this is how we can understand people who talk about particular topics. We can kind of group them into factions. So down in the orange, you had the autism community, so people who regularly spoke about autism. The pink were the kind of diehard anti-vaxxers. They'd been anti-vaxxers for a very long time. So you can see that, autism conversation is distinct from vaccines cause autism conversation. The teal kind of vertical cluster there was actually the hashtag, people who are also participating in the hashtag 2A, which in the US is Second Amendment gun rights. Why are anti-vaxxers talking to people in gun rights? Is because they were trying to kind of push the narrative that vaccines were vast government overreach and trying to draw more people from who were aligned with the idea that any government action was vast government overreach into their network to serve as amplifiers for their message. And then the kind of dark blue tiny cluster was actually what was interesting here. And that was really looking at the emergence of anti-vax accounts who were pivoting into serving as the bridge between those communities, where they stopped talking entirely about the vaccines cause autism thing, really moved into redefining their conversation in this new narrative about government overreach that seemed to be serving them better. And then the other finding was the green dots over there in the corner that are talking to no one and have no centrality whatsoever was the public health community. And so what we were trying to show here was the extent to which this was a conversation in which the voices that were supposed to serve as kind of like countervailing narratives, the counter speech, as we're so fond of calling it in America, were not actually counter-speaking to any of the people and were achieving no reach, no amplification whatsoever. So ironically, the green are what you would think of as traditional authority figures, traditional institutional folks from the CDC, the World Health Organization. So this was an example just of how we were doing that analysis to understand who was talking to whom and why. Now, at the same time, a friend of mine over at Brookings was doing identical work looking at ISIS. And one of the things, this is also 2015, this is not my work, this is from the ISIS Twitter census out of Brookings, which I highly recommend even today, is still a fascinating read. This is links among the top 500 Twitter accounts as supported by the in-group metric used to identify ISIS supporters, and the red lines indicated reciprocal relationships. So there too, we were looking at understanding how does a narrative spread, how is a narrative disseminated, what degree, like what shapes, what topology do we see in these networks to try to understand, again, how was ISIS so good at commanding a narrative on Twitter, which if you all remember back to 2015, this was a very significant issue. So we were comparing our findings, me on the anti-vaxxers, him on ISIS, and really just discovering that, again, very small groups of highly interlinked people could get things trending, could game the algorithms, and could really make it so that their message was the message that was seen. So the dissemination of the narrative is a function of the rules of the ecosystem in which it's being spread. And so one of the things that we came to this conclusion in 2015, that disinformation campaigns were not a truth and narrative issue. Disinformation campaigns and influence operations are actually a systems level problem because the architecture, the information ecosystem is designed to facilitate this sharing across platform. This was a thing that, all the platforms have the button where you can share it, or did for till about 2-3 years ago, where you could share, your Twitter would push to your Facebook could do the same thing in reverse. And it was the idea that they wanted information to kind of flow across the network, but nobody at any point was doing any kind of checking for what was flowing across the network or how it was working. So the platforms kind of inadvertently set the rules of a game that they weren't necessarily aware that they were even designing. We began to think of this as actually a kind of dual-use technology, right? Something that any group of people could use, but as we increasingly saw, ISIS was using it, and that became a very real problem. And then the kind of whisper conversation that was already happening in 2015 was that Russia was using it as well. You may remember that the Adrian Chen's article, The Agency, had come out already in June 2015, and so the Internet Research Agency was already a thing that was not known only to the national security community, but was actually, in fact, known among anybody in the public who was paying attention as well. So just to do kind of a quick walkthrough for how this all plays out, we started thinking about the early olden days of the internet. You all had like GeoCities blogs and such, I imagine. I know I did. So the idea of zero-cost publishing, ways in which we transform the information architecture by making it so that anybody and everybody had a voice, which was fantastic. And in the early days of blogs, that was still very decentralized. So you could write whatever you wanted. Misinformation propaganda, of course, proliferated then as well. Nobody was arguing that this was a new problem. But when you began to layer in the era of social networks and the mass consolidation of audiences, 300 and something million people, I think, on Twitter and 1 billion on Facebook, you start to see this, this audience, this ready-made standing audience that's available for any propagandist who wants to use it. Then, because these platforms have to earn revenue somehow, you see the advent of the advertising-based business model, which comes with it monitoring and precision targeting, a phrase that is in the US is used quite commonly as surveillance capitalism. But the idea that the platforms, the more that they know about you, the better they can target you. That's done, of course, in service to ads. In terms of their ability to sell highly targeted ads requires them to know a fair bit about who you are. But that targeting is also used then, it's also incorporated into algorithmic curation. And this is where, as everybody becomes a content creator on this handful of platforms, the platforms are forced into a position where in order to create a good experience, they have to curate. And this is where we move from the reverse chronological feed into the curated feed, which is one of the kind of major shifts that actually makes it, that actually really reinforces the idea that what is sensational, what is extreme, is much more likely to be engaged with because the algorithm recognizes that it starts to see these indicators of emotional engagement, of virality, and it begins to amplify that content. So the platforms have to curate your content in order to keep you on site so that they can keep serving you ads. So this becomes a self-fulfilling cycle. The algorithmic amplification piece is where users are drawn into the participatory nature of this. Every time you click to share, you've reinforced, you've generated a signal that indicates that this information is something that other people could see. When Twitter has a trending algorithm, and you may remember Facebook used to have one as well, that was really just based originally on pure signals of engagement. So the amplification would come if a sufficient number of people could game the algorithm, all use the same hashtag at the same time, and get something trending. So this, of course, has unintended consequences, becomes a dual-use technology as governments all over the world, as terrorist organizations, as groups of people begin to realize that this is a phenomenal vector for the dissemination of propaganda, and if regular rank-and-file people can achieve this kind of virality and this sort of command of the information architecture, then they can as well. So what we begin to see now is over the last, I think, 5 years, we've seen case studies. Oxford does some really great work on this. There's case studies detailing computational propaganda, as it's come to be called, and malign influence activity in Brazil, Canada, China, Estonia, France, Germany, India, Italy, Iran, Mexico, Myanmar, the Philippines, Poland, Russia. I could go on, the US. We've got the terrorists up there too. So the list continues to grow. And as we've begun now with 5 years of case studies and evidence of this kind of activity, patterns have begun to emerge. So this is our collection of actors who regularly, at this point, are running these playbooks. You have the state actors. They're by far the most well-resourced. They also often control a media ecosystem, the mainstream media in their countries, which affords them kind of an extra boost as propaganda splits between narrative dissemination across the media versus mimetic social dissemination on the networks. So state actors are the best resourced. Sophisticated terrorist organizations like ISIS did in fact run their own media organizations as well. They had magazines. They were again running the same two-track parallel between narrative propaganda and mimetic social propaganda. Domestic ideologues, less well-resourced, but oftentimes, particularly in the US, well-networked into the media ecosystem. Again, you see that same sort of thing. And then, as we've begun to see, the mercenaries, I'm not going to talk about this today because it just came out last week, but one of the things that we just did at Stanford was we worked with Facebook to identify a network of mercenaries attributed to Yevgeny Prigozhin, operating in Africa, 83 pages, 8 countries, the franchise model in which the actual execution of the operation is carried out by local social media enterprises who probably don't know who's paying them. There's the opportunity to really launder things down to mercenaries who are willing to carry out these operations for money. And then the last is spammers, which, they're more of the kind of throw it at the wall, see what sticks. They know they're going to lose their accounts constantly. It doesn't really matter so much to them, but we do see spammers as an active part of this ecosystem. So in addition to kind of mapping out the actors, we've begun kind of trying to quantify the goals. Apologies for the word slide here. But again, the goals run the gamut. You can roughly group them into persuasion, distraction. The persuasion style is really looking to make people feel or think a certain way about a topic. That's often a lot harder because that involves changing hearts and minds, and as anybody who's ever run an advertising campaign or marketing campaign knows, that's not always easy. So some of this operates in the persuasion space where you can develop a long-term relationship and really repeatedly put out content because it's through repetition and availability that kind of narrative takes hold. The other thing, though, the other rough bucket that we see is the distraction. Make it too hard for people to figure out what the hell is going on. The kind of canonical example of this, for anybody who pays attention to it, is the hashtag MH17. That was the Malaysia Airlines jet that was shot down over Ukraine. That triggered a rather panicked response in which the zone was flooded with dozens and dozens and dozens of explanations for how the actual perpetrators responsible were in fact not. And so that's where you just blast out as much crap as you can into the hashtag to make it so that anybody who's going and looking and trying to understand what's happening either has to follow only their own trusted media because the social ecosystem becomes relatively useless. So the kind of broad takeaway from that is that disinformation is not a truth and narrative problem. You're not going to solve it by fact-checking. Back in 2015, 2016, we still thought that there was an opportunity to really just, if you got the fact-check out, you were going to solve the problem. That's just not true, and that's because velocity and virality ensure that this has gone viral already. This kind of, just the sheer ability to use bots and algorithmic amplification to flood a zone means that you are never going to reach the same amount of people with the fact-check. So we started thinking less about how do we handle this as a fact-checking issue, and more about how do we think about this as a dissemination problem, as an information traversal problem. So there's a really great quote that I want to just make sure I don't botch from American Enterprise Institute's Phil Lohaus. And he says something that I think is interesting from the standpoint of this bridge between disinformation and cybersecurity. We tend to think of our cyber defenses as physical barricades, barring access from would-be perpetrators, and of information campaigns as retrograde and ineffective. In other words, we continue to focus on the walls of the castle while our enemies are devising methods to poison the air. So, recognizing that, when we think about addressing the problem of computational disinformation campaigns, one of the things that we've been starting to do is look at intelligence-driven defense, which is how can we take our understanding, again, not as how do we counter one narrative or deal with one adversary, but how do we think about a staged process for really kind of quantifying, understanding, and then looking at places to intercede. So this is one of the things where, major advancement in the practice of defense information security has been the adoption of intelligence-driven defense, where defensive teams base their plans and priorities on models of attacker capabilities and techniques based on observational evidence. So how do we take those 53 case studies of the kind of matrix of actors and goals and come up with models for understanding what this looks like? So I know there's kind of mixed feelings about the kill chain itself, but the metaphor is something that's been really appealing to us as we've begun to think about how to get ourselves out of just talking about truth and narrative. So we've been thinking more about how disinformation campaigns they kind of unfold across this series of stages. They're largely invisible to the audience until they hit the end stages, when all of a sudden the audience sees the content. So how do we look further up the chain and understand where what are the things that the attackers are consistently doing in order to enable that the sort of mass blast at the end? Probably most of you in the room have seen this. This is me just grabbing the Lockheed version. There's a couple of other versions. But this is sort of the process by which you can achieve kind of control and then affect actions on objectives. So what we're trying to do here is think in a similar way about what is the staging process by which this is happening. So, click, there we go. This is the world's most primitive graphic. This is something I made for a Senate briefing in early 2017. This was literally me trying to explain to lawmakers how this worked. So, but I keep this slide around actually just to show you where we were in 2017. Really, it was a very repetitive process. There was actually nothing remarkable about it. Everybody did the same thing over and over again. You would plan your operation in these little groups, mostly where people communicate one-on-one. Sometimes they're very overt. Sometimes it's like Reddit, where anyone can go and read it. Other times they're much more, they move more and more into quiet spaces, Discord servers, WeChat or WhatsApp groups. So that becomes actually, this is an example of things that as the practice evolves, no longer can you see people on Reddit or 4chan just kind of talking about their operation out there in the public. That moves more and more into quieter spaces. Then there's the content creation. The content creation piece is interesting because they're hosting their content on platforms that are going to give them algorithmic lift as well. So it's a kind of we've created even YouTube and Imgur in the places where you would ordinarily, in the olden days, you would have had to like host your content on your blog and then drive people to it. If you create something that's in any way compelling, the platform itself, particularly if you get the keywords right, will begin to serve that content up as well. Then there's the main campaign. Tumblr is still in there. Tumblr really doesn't exist anymore, but this was where we would see this content manifesting. So you'd see ISIS on all of these channels, Russia on all of these channels. The campaign piece varies regionally. So as I'm looking at Taiwan right now, we see a lot more stuff on like Line and some of the message boards that are unique to the information ecosystem where people are spending their time. So any attacker is going to go to where the target is, and so one of the things that we're always looking at is where are the people in a given region. It doesn't do a whole lot of good. One of the things we saw with the Russia-Africa operation that came down last week was the use of WhatsApp and Telegram, and that's because that's where people in the region, those are the tools that they're using. So they're on Facebook, which is one way that actually outside researchers can see them, but they're increasingly moving more and more into group messages and sort of either end-to-end encrypted spaces or spaces where you have to be invited in. And then the final piece, though, is how do you cross the chasm? So you're doing one of two things. You can persuade your small, tiny cluster of people, and they're not always the smallest. Sometimes, as in the US, there are hundreds of thousands of people, but so you're working on your clusters. But what you really want to do is create the narrative that crosses the chasm and hits mainstream media. Because then at that point, you begin to dominate the entirety of the media narrative. The kind of canonical example of this is the GRU hack and leak in 2016, where even though we focus much more on Internet Research Agency activity, which was the social propaganda, the thing that really commanded the narrative was the GRU hack and leak operation, which drove mainstream media narrative about our campaign. They tranched the releases, so every time a new release comes out, US mainstream media covers it as a newsworthy thing. WikiLeaks is pushing it, which has millions of followers. And then you see the Internet Research Agency come in, take it, make memes about it, and push it out again. So you see hack and leak operating in conjunction with, even if not deliberately coordinated, temporally coordinated with the social influence side of the operation. This is the world's ugliest graphic. But this is how we're starting to think about understanding the staged process using the kind of 50 some odd examples that we have. So this will be coming out in a report, and it'll look different than this. But for today, we're thinking about creation of operational resources. One of the things that they all use is fake accounts. You have to have the fake accounts, and so the easiest place to intercede is with a better understanding of what it means to be authentic on the internet. That, of course, is a huge challenge, particularly because it really, in the US at least, triggers a lot of political opinions about the value of pseudonymity and anonymity. What are we saying about who is authentic, who has the right to participate? But at the same time, this is why it's dual use, the recognition that there is a lot of opportunity for other entities to kind of conceal themselves in those spaces. I'm going to go through these now kind of one at a time with examples drawn from different influence operations, and I'll talk a little bit about what we saw in those. So first, for creation of operational resources, as I'm sure many of you know, there's a black market for digital identity. You can go and you can buy Facebook accounts. You can purchase, this is one of them that I screenshotted actually 2 years ago in 2017. There are dozens of these. You can go by region. You want to go by vintage. Now they've actually started showing the vintage, and they'll tell you what you can do with it. This one is clear to run ads. That means it's going to cost you like 10 times as much. This one is this many years old and has had, they'll actually tell you, it's like, it's almost like buying a pet or something, where they list all of the attributes of the account, what you're going to get for your money, how likely it is that if you perform a certain action, it's going to trigger something else. They give you guidelines into how to kind of slowly morph it into being your identity. So this is actually not very hard to do. The platforms have tried to crack down. You won't find this necessarily on like Fiverr anymore. You'll have to go a little bit deeper to find it. But actually, interestingly, if you go to Instagram and you search fake accounts, or you search accounts or followers, there's Instagram is like funny enough, a message board for finding ways to bullshit Instagram. This is one example of the community infiltration piece. So now you have your fake account. Another slide I didn't show in this particular case is you can also buy engagement. So even if you have the accounts, one of the things that you can constantly do is buy engagement, which means that your tweets get liked, your Instagram posts get liked. It's risky sometimes because the platforms do look for that, but you can create a perception that your account is popular or your content is popular by buying engagement. This is the Internet Research Agency. BM was a website called Black Matters. It was a website, it was a Facebook account, it was an Instagram, it had a SoundCloud, it was everywhere. It had stickers. It was one of the examples. Sometimes when I do a talk just on the Internet Research Agency, this is one of the canonical examples. But what they're really doing here, as you can see, is there's a couple things happening. First, the same way we saw in the Africa operation that we just took down 2 years later, there's a recognition even then that if you infiltrate the community and get real people to serve as your mouthpiece, then you have that 1 degree of obscurity where instead of creating content with your fake profile where people might Google you and try to figure out, who you are, where you came from, and if you're even real, if you launder it through real people, unwitting, of course, people, this is where you start to see that degree of obfuscation that makes it very, very hard to find once it's real people who are involved. The other real challenge is once real people get involved, if they don't know who's behind it, they are extremely aggrieved when their stuff does come down. And so as we've seen in the Africa takedown, the resulting week has been people who are tweeting saying, why did my page come down? Why didn't Facebook tell me what was going on? So the content comes down. And oftentimes, if you are particularly a social media manager that's running one of these operations that you're unwitting, your other stuff is all going to come down as well because it's going to be seen as linked to the broader operation. But so this is how the infiltration of community works. As we saw in the US, they were remarkably effective at this. They were actually sending money to activists to fund real-world protests. They were paying people to teach self-defense classes in local neighborhoods to this was a operation called Black Fist, which was trying to get the community thinking more about becoming more militant in its opposition to police. So there is this, again, it's really described very much as a social influence operation, but it's an extremely hybrid thing where there are these infiltration tactics and ways in which they're actively trying to facilitate action in the real world. Identify an opportunity space. This is Hong Kong. These are the protests this is maybe a month back now. There was a moment in the Hong Kong protests, this comes from where a police officer shot a beanbag at a protester and she lost her eye. How many of you saw that, I'm curious, on Twitter or elsewhere? Okay, so I'm like extremely online and I saw it on Twitter almost immediately after it happened. But what happened next was very interesting, which was much the same way as during the Iran protests. There was that woman named Neha who got shot and she became a meme. She became the iconography of the protest movement. When you have that moment where something becomes iconic like that, and all of these other people begin wearing this mask over their eye in solidarity and literally creating iconography around this moment, you see the state react at that point. And so the reaction was almost instantaneous. The China bots, that's what we call them, they're not really bots, they're actually operated by humans. But the China cyborgs began to come out of the woodwork to, again, flood the zone and discredit the narrative. She had been shot by her own people. She was really a violent protester. She hadn't been shot at all. Again, flood the zone, make it impossible to know what had actually happened. And this is a panic response. This is not a slow, long game, multi-year, grow your audience influence play. This is we are responding to a moment in time in which we have to retake control of the narrative, and barring that, we have to make it impossible for people to know what's going on. That action, the response to this, actually did lead to Facebook and Twitter taking down a couple thousand accounts and taking the remarkable step, actually, of attributing them to PRC, which is something that we hadn't seen happen before. So produce or appropriate content. A lot of people look at this and think it's Russia. This is actually Iran. So one of the things that we see is, again, the recognition across multiple states that this is a playbook that is effective, that this kind of mimetic propaganda works, it resonates, it spreads. And so this is where you see the production, sometimes the appropriation of content. Russia, being much more sophisticated than most of the others, has just moved into Internet Research Agency, I shouldn't say Russia, but has moved into the appropriation of content. So they take the most polarizing images from real, authentic media, and they just amplify them. And that allows them to not necessarily be discovered in the process of creating new content. It also creates real challenges for the social platforms around the question of what does it mean to be authentic when the content is coming from hyper-polarized American media. So again, what we're trying to say over and over again is the issue of authenticity is not a truth and narrative issue. It's what is the voice that's putting the content out, what is the dissemination pattern of the content, and then the last layer of analysis is really what is the content, because we're constantly trying to avoid a perception of takedowns based on political or partisan issue. Then there's the targeted dissemination. So you've created the content, then you spread it. Inside Syria Media Center, this is a GRU operation. So again, the Internet Research Agency is not the only thing that runs these out of Russia. This is the GRU articles by S. Mangal, that is Sophie Mangal. Sophie Mangal does not exist. And yet Sophie Mangal managed to place her bylined content in something like 40 quote-unquote independent media sources within the US. So again, the creation of the persona moving not only through the social space, but also through the narrative space. This is one of the, this is the kind of computational amplification. There were a number of these that happened in response, again, much like the China-Hong Kong response, when Jamal Khashoggi was killed. You saw the Saudi bots beginning to do the same thing. There was a lot more automation there. They were relatively unsophisticated. The networks were largely taken down, but there were a number of hashtags. One of the more prominent ones was "We all trust Mohammed bin Salman." And so again, you see that same type of using computational bots to flood the zone in a moment of crisis to kind of bolster, in this case, more of a persuasive, less about putting out 60 different narratives, though they did that too, creating persuasion. And then this is what it looks like when it really, when an operation crosses the chasm. This is Sean Hannity, extremely prominent, I hesitate to say news, polemicist on Fox, who began to involve himself in the cover-up story around the GRU hack and leak operation. Very interestingly, as I'm sure you've all seen numerous times, there's the misattribution strategies. We see misattribution quite a bit in influence operations, where the GRU response to the hack and leak operations and the social influence operations was to begin to put out the story that they had not in fact hacked the DNC at all. It had been a leak. The leak had come from this murdered staffer named Seth Rich, who was shot in a apparently unrelated crime based on police reports. But because of that, that haziness around who had killed him and the fact that nobody was ever found, it was temporarily convenient for them, and so they and WikiLeaks began to push out this narrative that this young man had actually been the leaker, and then you start to see that propaganda spread. It's trending on Twitter constantly. Hashtag his name was Seth Rich. You see both real, authentic American, both conspiracy theorists and hyper-partisans begin to spread that narrative. You see Russian bot networks come in to amplify it, and then it makes its way all the way to Hannity, and he begins to run stories about whether, Seth Rich as the source of the leaked materials on Fox News. And there's actually an ongoing lawsuit happening right now. His family is suing, but this is what it looks like when that social propaganda, that social influence operation really crosses, leaps in, and becomes national news. And this is exactly what you want, because now a very real percentage of American public believes that the Russia hack was not executed by Russia, and that this guy was responsible. So now what? So now we have a sense of how these campaigns work. We have this idea of staging. This is the second, this is probably even more ugly graphic. This is how we're trying to think about, again, that same sort of what's the matrix that we come up with? If creating operational resources is the key, what are ways that we can detect that? What are ways that we can deny them the ability to do that? What are ways that we can disrupt the networks that are in place? So we're starting to try to think, and this is extremely rough and raw right now, but this is where some of the work that we're doing now is thinking much more about how do you populate responses according to stages, and how do we think about this as a more, understanding the attack vectors with the goal of disrupting the operation. So recognizing adversarial attack patterns and disinformation means that we can design not only more effective reactive strategies, but we can also be thinking about predictive strategies. And so now we have our corpus of 53 events. We can see, again, this every time the platforms change the rules, whether that's a policy decision, a new feature, a new entrant, like I didn't have TikTok up on my first slide, right? There's anytime new rules come into the space, what we're starting to do now is red team out. How can we think about how those will each be incorporated into the future operations that we'll be seeing? This is a thing that we care quite a bit about. We're in the middle of our primary season right now in the US, and then we've got the 2020 election coming up. So instead of being, we don't want to be caught in the trap of thinking about what happened in 2016 and expecting that same type of thing to happen again. We want to be thinking about 3 years later, with new policy in place, with new intelligence organizations within, each of the platforms now have their own integrity team that is looking for this stuff actively. We work with them at Stanford on the Africa takedown. We found some part of the network. They found some part of the network. We're trying to think about really where do the capabilities lie, who can see what and when, where do the responsibilities lie, how can we create systems whereby people are talking about this. We have a lot of connections now between civil society, government, media, and researchers, so that is all in place in a way that it was not 3 years ago, and that's why we are able to achieve the kind of takedowns of these networks that we are today. But one of the reasons I'm here is actually just to think about what are other people seeing in other spaces that are adjacent, and how can we be thinking about sharing information more effectively. So I want to go to questions. I would say in summary, influence operations are here to stay. This is not going anywhere. We don't think about it as solving them or stopping them. We think about it as more of a management of a chronic condition. We think about it as this is not a truth and narrative issue. It's about the exploitation and a coordinated attack on a social information ecosystem. How do we think about that? And then the last point is the one I just made. Platforms, industry, government, and other organizations have to be working together to address the collective vulnerabilities. So I think we're going to go to questions now. And thank you very much for listening.